The rain came down in thin, dirty needles that turned the cobbles into black glass, and the city smelled of brine, horses, and rotting figs. It was the kind of morning when Istanbul seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the Bosphorus wind to decide whether the day would drown or burn. Down by the docks of Karakoy, a boy's voice called out, high and thin, as he vanished between carts. Mehmet Rashid tightened his coat, his hand instinctively touching the baton at his belt. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was just a zapta, a street cop. But habits died hard. He moved through the press of porters, beggars, and dock clerks until he reached the corner where the disturbance had been reported. A laundry basket lay overturned, shirts scattered in the mud like drowned birds. The girl who owned them was gone. Mehmet crouched, ignoring the stink of fish water, and picked up a silver bracelet half buried in the filth. Not the kind of trinket a laundress could afford. This had been stamped by a Haskoy goldsmith, initials neat on the inside. He turned it in his fingers. Fresh scrape. Torn clasp. It had been ripped off. "Rashid," someone called. He looked up to see Bakir, a fellow zapta, broad-shouldered and slow-eyed, waving from the shade of a tobacco shop. Bakir shook his head. "Not our business. Girl runs off, girl comes back, or she doesn't. Don't waste ink." Mehmet slipped the bracelet into his pocket. "And if she doesn't?" Bakir shrugged, already turning away. "Then another girl washes shirts tomorrow." The street swallowed the moment, but Mehmet stayed crouched, his eyes sweeping the ground. A set of footprints led away from the basket. Bare feet, quick, cut across by heavier boot prints. He followed them down a dripping alley that stank of old piss and mold. Halfway down, the trail vanished in a swirl of mud where a cart had turned. Only the ruts remained, and a single handprint pressed into the muck, small and desperate. By noon, the docks had shifted into their usual chaos. Stevedores shouting, ferries unloading, gulls screaming overhead. Mehmet stopped by a tea stall, ordered a glass, and slid the bracelet across the counter to the owner. The man, an Armenian with ink-stained thumbs, lifted it and squinted. "Saw this work last month. Haskoy, old Moshe's shop. He doesn't sell to dock rats. Whoever had this had a patron." Mehmet left without finishing his tea. By dusk, he was standing under the crooked sign of Moshe the goldsmith. The old man looked up from his bench, magnifying lens still on one eye. "Bracelet?" he muttered. "Yes, I sold it. To a woman, veiled. Thumb scar like she cut herself to the bone. Paid full price." "Name?" Mehmet asked. Moshe spread his hands. "Do I ask names when money is good?" Outside, the call to prayer rolled over the rooftops like distant thunder. Mehmet stood in the fading light, the bracelet heavy in his pocket, and watched the crowds file past. Somewhere in the city, a girl was gone, a scarred woman was buying trinkets for ghosts, and the ledger of human flesh that ran through Istanbul's veins had just written another entry. He was a dockside cop with no orders, no allies, and no protection. But he could still follow ink, silver, and blood. That night, in the damp little room he rented above a spice shop, Mehmet spread the bracelet on the table beside a stub of candle. He sketched its mark onto a scrap of paper, then folded it carefully into the lining of his jacket. The streets below never quieted. Donkeys brayed, sailors fought, a baby wailed into the dark. He sat there, listening, feeling the city breathe like a restless animal. When dawn broke, he was already moving again. He trailed whispers through Galata, stopping at a bathhouse where women scrubbed clothes and traded rumors. One of them, her hands raw and pink, leaned in and said quietly, "You're asking about girls. Then ask about the aunties. They promise work in the big houses, but no one comes back from those jobs. No one." By evening, Mehmet found himself standing outside a brothel disguised as a guest house, its lanterns swaying in the sea wind. A runner he recognized from the palace stables slipped inside with a grin too wide for his face. Mehmet's hand closed over the bracelet. The city was rotting from the top down, and he had just touched the nerve. The stench of boiled onions and damp wool clung to the stairwell as Mehmet pushed open the warped door of a tenement near Fener. Inside, the air was thick with soap steam, but the children weren't laughing. They sat silent, staring with wide eyes. A woman in her 40s, kerchief tied tight, moved between them with the brisk authority of a nurse. Yet her apron pockets bulged with papers, and her ledger lay half hidden beneath a stack of linen. The midwife. Her name was whispered in every alley, Fatma Ana, auntie, to half the neighborhood. Mehmet had expected kindness in her face. What he found was calculation, sharp as a knife's edge. "You're late, Zapta," she said without looking up. Her voice was steady, too steady. "These streets don't forgive men who ask too many questions." "I'm not here for forgiveness," Mehmet replied. He placed the silver bracelet on the table between them. The children's eyes followed it, their silence heavy. Fatma's lips thinned. "Pretty trinket," she said. "Not yours. Leave it." Her hand twitched toward the ledger. Mehmet caught the movement and pulled the book free. The pages reeked of smoke, half charred, but lines of names and dates still survived. Girls, ages, payments noted as linen, coal, bread. He read one aloud. "A laundress, 17, last marked delivered." Fatma's calm cracked. "That's private." "No," Mehmet said, voice low. "That's murder written in ink." The door creaked. A man slipped in, shoulders broad, smelling of tar and river muck. He carried himself like a man used to the oar. His eyes flicked from Mehmet to the ledger, then to Fatma, a boatman, the kind who ferried people across the Golden Horn at night when no ferry ran. "Get him out," the boatman muttered. Mehmet stepped closer, holding the ledger. "Where do you take them?" The boatman spat on the floor. "I row. I don't ask." But his eyes betrayed him, nervous, darting, ashamed. Mehmet pressed harder. "You row to the wrong pier, and you don't come back. That's the rule." Fatma slammed a pan onto the stove, the clang sharp enough to make the children flinch. "You think you're a hero? You're a clerk with a badge. You'll be ordered to hand that book back before sunset." She was right. His sergeant had already warned him once. "Leave it, Rashid. You'll end up on the wrong side of the Bosphorus feeding fish." But Mehmet had seen enough dead fish in his time to know the smell of rot. The boatman shifted as if ready to bolt. Mehmet blocked the doorway. "Who pays you?" A long silence. Then, barely above a whisper, "The steward. Coffeehouse by the fish market. He writes the orders. The money comes from higher." "How high?" Mehmet pressed. The boatman's mouth opened, then shut again. He glanced at Fatma, whose eyes burned with fury. Finally, he muttered a name like poison spat on the floor. "Halil Rıza Pasha." The words hung heavy in the room. A man too powerful to touch, his name spoken only in fear. A sudden crash. Fatma hurled the boiling pot at Mehmet. He ducked, the scalding water hissing against the wall. The boatman shoved past him, bolting down the stairs. Mehmet grabbed the ledger, ignoring the steam burns on his arm, and stumbled into the rain-soaked street. Behind him, the midwife's voice echoed from the window above. You think you can bleed the empire dry, boy? You'll drown in it first." By midnight, Mehmet was hunched in a back-alley coffeehouse, the ledger hidden under his coat. The steward sat at a corner table, counting coins and writing in neat columns. Only the words weren't about girls. They were sacks of coal, bundles of cloth, crates of fish, coded trade. Mehmet ordered tea and watched. Every entry was dated to the hour, timed with uncanny precision, and each coincided with naval patrol gaps along the Horn. Smugglers didn't have that kind of foresight. Only the palace did. He scribbled notes onto scraps of paper, each one a stitch in a noose. The ledger might vanish in another kitchen fire, but the truth was already lodged in his mind. When he stepped outside, the fog off the Bosphorus was thick as wool. He felt eyes on him. The street was empty, but somewhere in the mist, someone coughed softly. Mehmet touched the bracelet in his pocket as though its cold silver might steady his pulse. The city was awake, and now it was watching him. Night fell like a lid. The coffeehouse by the fish market emptied one man at a time. Chairs flipped onto tables, stove embers cooled into a dull red eye. Mehmet waited in the alley until the last broom sweep stopped and the bolt slid home. Then he slipped through the courtyard past buckets and ropes and eased a window open with the blade of his pocket knife. The air inside was sour with stale tobacco and cardamom. He moved in a crouch, fingers brushing the wall until they found the small office door at the back. The steward's desk was neat in the moonlight. Inkstone, blotter, a ledger bound in brown calf. He lit no lamp. He worked by the square of pale light and the fragile memory of columns he'd already memorized. Each line was a shape, a rhythm. 2 sacks coal, 1 crate fish, 4 bolts linen. Dates, hours. He unspooled paper from his coat and copied like a thief who steals only patterns. Halfway down a page, he stopped. A clause had changed. Linen, extra fine, to K3. He traced K3 with his thumb. The steward had switched to a different cipher. Mehmet's mouth went dry. He copied anyway, counting lines under his breath, hearing only the sea and his own pulse. When he closed the book, he noticed something he hadn't before. A smudge on the desk where the steward's wrist always rested. A crescent of ground black. Graphite. The man had been drafting letters. Mehmet slid open the top drawer. Nothing but twine and sealing wax. The second drawer stuck. He pried gently and found a bundle of notes bound with blue ribbon. Receipts for charcoal deliveries to a photography studio on a side street off Voivoda Avenue. He replaced everything exactly as he'd found it and went out the way he'd come, easing the window down until the latch kissed the sill. The alley stank of cat piss and sardine heads. When he turned to go, a whisper of cloth came from the far end. A man stood there, not hiding, not advancing. Plain coat, hat pulled low. The man smoked without inhaling, eyes flat as coins. Mehmet walked past him, feeling the stare like a nail between his shoulder blades. The man didn't follow. He didn't have to. He'd been seen. At dawn, Mehmet stood at the telegraph office counter with a folded banknote under his palm. The clerk was a narrow boy with ink on his cuffs and nerves for sale. "Show me yesterday's traffic from Galata to Üsküdar," Mehmet said softly, "especially any messages through the naval dispatch line." The boy glanced at the coin's edge like it might bite him. "Sir, Mehmet slid the banknote forward and looked him in the eye. "And today's." The boy disappeared into the back and returned with a stack of copied strips. They smelled of oil and dust. Mehmet read them standing up, jaw clenched. Messages about fuel shortages, The shifting of a patrol boat from the Horn to the Bosphorus, a 10-minute window at midnight. Another strip, coded in a clerk's lazy shorthand, mentioned cloth consignments to be moved under darkness to the eastern quay. He folded the strips into his sleeve and left, feeling watched all the way to the corner. Aram found him before noon at a table by an open window where damp sunlight pushed in like dirty water. The journalist had a face that could either charm or offend, and eyes that never stopped counting. "You look like a man climbing a ladder with someone shaking the bottom," Aram said, taking the chair without asking. "Tell me you brought me rope." "I brought ink," Mehmet said, and slid over one copied page. Aram scanned it, whistled low. Coal, fish, linen. Of course, you can hide a slave in any cargo if the paperwork agrees she's a sack. He tapped the cipher marks. "But a pasha's name is air until it's iron. You don't have iron." "I have a steward, a boatman, a midwife with a ledger and burned scars." And one dead official ends the story as robbery gone wrong. Aram shrugged. "If you want this to stick, you need flesh, a face, something you can print that makes a mother wake her husband and say, 'Look.' You need a photograph?" The word trembled between them. Mehmet thought of the charcoal receipts and the studio off Voivoda. He left without finishing his coffee. The studio looked like any other tradesman's front. Dusty glass, a faded backdrop hanging crooked behind it, flies worrying a strip of glue. Inside, the photographer's assistant was sweeping. She was young and bored, hair pinned quick, eyes red from fumes. "We're closed," she said. "I want a portrait," Mehmet replied and pointed to the samples on the wall. Men in frock coats, a sailor with a stiff cap, a child with a ribbon. "Of a girl," he added. 17, laundry hands, silver bracelet. The assistant's broom scraped to a stop. "We don't do that kind of business," she said too quickly. "Nor do I," Mehmet said. "I just look at light." He drifted along the frames and let his fingers find the cool edge of a door curtain that hung slightly off its rail. He pushed it a thumb's width. Behind it, a narrow corridor, smell of collodion and spoiled egg. He stepped through, the assistant protesting, and found a small room at the back. On a table sat a wooden box of glass plates wrapped in newspaper. The towels on the peg were damp and slightly sweet. He unwrapped a plate at random and held it to the window. The emulsion was dark, but as he tilted it, a face floated up, the blank stare of a girl staring past the camera, hair pulled tight, a bruise fading yellow at her temple. He unwrapped another. 2 girls this time, seated, hands in laps, a veiled woman behind them, like a benevolent ghost. This was no family parlor trade. A floorboard creaked behind him. "Careful," the assistant said, voice gone flat. "The owner is particular." The owner arrived 2 minutes later, with courtesy sharpened to a point. He was tall, suited, with a flower in his lapel, and fingers stained the peculiar mahogany of chemical baths. "Inspector?" he asked, smiling too pleasantly. "Or customer?" "Neither," Mehmet said. "I'm thirsty." The man blinked. "Tea?" "Light," Mehmet said. "Sometimes it poisons." He set the plate back in its box with exaggerated care. "Your charcoal supplier is the coffeehouse by the fish market. Your deliveries coincide with nights when the patrols move. A coincidence that would make God blush." The smile thinned. "You can't be here." "Then call someone and tell them I was," Mehmet said. He shifted slightly, enough to put his back to the window, and let his eyes mark what he needed to see. the hook by the door where keys hung on a leather thong, the cupboard with a lock, the thin line of light under a second door. It went fast after that. The assistant turned to fetch tea and slid a glance at the owner that said, "Run." The owner didn't run. He lifted his hand as if to adjust his lapel and produced a small razor gleaming like a fishbone. Mehmet moved first. The stool beside him scraped loudly as he knocked it over, the sudden crash splitting the moment. His baton came free, short and ugly, and he rapped the man's wrist hard enough to make the razor ring on the floor. The assistant screamed. Mehmet put the baton away and said quietly, "Open the cupboard." Behind the cupboard door, a camera, lenses, chemicals, and a second box of plates stamped with a neat letter K and the numbers 1 through 12 in grease pencil. He lifted K7. The plate was thin, its image faint, but the eyes were unmistakable. The missing laundress, alive, unsmiling, a cloth laid over her shoulders like a shawl. The silver bracelet flashed in the corner of the frame, as if the emulsion itself remembered. Mehmet wrapped the plate in his own newspaper and slid it inside his coat between the lining and his shirt, where he could feel the cold against his ribs. "Who pays for these sessions?" he asked, not looking up. "No one," the owner said. "They pay me to burn them." He believed it. Not every face was for keeping. Some were for proof that vanished. Mehmet stood very still, listening. In the courtyard, a foot scuffed. On the street, a voice called and stopped. The watcher from the alley would not be far. He pocketed one more plate, K8 just in case, and stepped backward to the door. The owner held his hand, wrist livid where the baton had kissed bone. "If you walk out," the man said softly, "you will not make it to the corner." Mehmet opened the door, a slice of gray light cutting across the floor. "Then I'll stand in the middle of the street and make them shoot me in front of witnesses," he said. "People are braver when the dark is behind glass." He slipped into the daylight. The street was narrow and wet, the sky low. The plain-coat watcher appeared at the end like a stain pulled through cloth. Mehmet didn't run. He walked one measured step at a time, the glass plate a shard of winter pressed to his heart, the city's breath in his ear like a word he refused to learn.